Today's speaker is Catie Newell, who is on campus this week conducting workshops with students in the GLASS program and in other art disciplines. And we're happy and pleased to be hosting this lecture in partnership with the School of Art today. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Architecture Professor Tim Gray, who will tell you more about our guest.
Thank you, Dave, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Catie Newell, who is an associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan's Taubman College. Catie is also the founding principal of Alibi Studio and is a Lucas Fellow, a Kresge Artist Fellow, and a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome. Her studio is recognized for exploring design, construction, and materiality in relationship to location and geography. Catie's works draws from and informs multiple disciplines and bridges between architecture and art. I'd like to also welcome Catie back to Ball State, where she gave a lecture here. I think we just determined it was in 2015. Catie gave a great lecture and led a workshop with my fourth year architecture studio, which resulted in an installation in the upstairs of the downtown facility, the Muncie Lab on Walnut Street. And it was a really great experience for myself as well as my students. So delighted to have Catie back and see what she's been up to since the last visit. Please join me in welcoming Catie.
Double mics. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks, Tim, for the introduction. It's so wonderful to be back. I was trying to remember as well when the last time I was here. And I can distinctly remember the setup of this auditorium, people hovering above on the second floor, which I think is kind of amazing architecturally. So it's great to be back, and it's been an interesting moment to also think, what have I done since then? Or what am I still thinking about? So the lecture tonight is going to be interdispersed a little bit of work that I might have even shown then, probably did, some of my earlier work, as well as new things that I've done since 2015. And for me, it ends up being an interesting sort of personal reflection on the themes that remain really current, and even some of the things that can go through effects that are made, or even kind of architectural maneuvers that come back for me in very, very peculiar ways. I don't know if it's possible for the lighting to go down a little bit. I tend to have really dark images. Should have tested that before, but I didn't think to ask.
I think it is. I might not be the right person to do it.
This gives you a good sense of how dark they can be.
How about that?
That's great, right? Everybody okay with that? I ask maybe for the lights go down because I think it's fair to recognize that my work often works a lot with light and darkness, and in fact, generally considers light and darkness to be the sort of main occupants of the space. So working with those, even working about those, I think tend to underscore all the projects. And I have a tendency as well to work with spaces in a way that's very much so about process. I think often that I'm literally in a way sort of drawing in a space, remaking with space. I think with working with light and darkness, I'm also very much so trying to remain super attentive to what's happening and basically, in a way malleable and with a lot of dexterity to watching the effects as they happen and then working alongside with them. So a lot of that ends up being everything from being attentive to the material qualities to how we're making, questioning why we're making and what we're making. So I'm actually going to start with an older project that I think maybe underscores a lot of the themes that will come through in all of them. Again, I already mentioned light and darkness. I think for us, it's also often about the material pursuits that match with this and hosting those two effects. And there's a lot, I think you'll see recurring theme for me is working with existing spaces. I have a huge interest in tapping into the lineage of a story or an architecture and what's already there, and remaking with it, generally in a very kind of temporary or ephemeral way. So the first project I want to show, which I have to say, I'm very also delighted, it's in this book that I guess is getting raffled off, so more details in there if you end up getting the book, which has also been great to have been brought to my attention today. But so the work Weatherizing, I think if we give it a just sort of general, summation of what it is, it's the sort of replacement of a flat pane window in a space. It's in a space that was no longer being used for what it's used for, and one that was trying to delicately balance a way to consider how we're bringing in light, keeping darkness, and maybe, let's just say, reinterpreting what we generally consider to be a window. And the work actually started, I was working, this is quite some time ago. There was a group of fellows, those of us who were fellows at the University of Michigan. We were together working collaboratively on a house, reworking with, basically using a house as a place to do architectural studies in Detroit at a time when we were able to use houses that weren't currently being tended to. And as my colleagues were starting to make large maneuvers in the house itself, I recognized that one thing that was happening was that the greater light was actually starting to leak in. And I was actually really interested in the fact that the spaces, when encapsulated, were actually encapsulating large volumes of darkness. And so there was a way to sort of consider the spaces that were at that time being unused as being lots of volumes of darkness that we could hold precious, or that we even couldn't see if we weren't, in essence, choosing to be inside of them. So I moved to the detached garage. And there was a pretty key moment in that, which I found just in terms of reading a space and understanding a space to be taken down to its architectural elements. So with just the simple light leaks, of course, we get the door swing, you get the implied window, and I started to try to develop a relationship between how much light could be let in or not to balance this sort of darkness. So one of my first maneuvers was actually to entirely darken this space. So cover up the light leaks, get it to that dark volume. An earlier experiment that I had done in the house, which becomes sort of obvious in its kind of how it played out, was to place glass tubes all the way through the wall section. They work like giant optical fibers. And we're bringing light in a really interesting way, just in terms of thinking about the passage of air, the passage of sound, and what is generally for us flat pane, moving it into something that now has a longer length and starts in aggregation to make a bigger volume. So in the garage, I started to add those very carefully around what was the key architectural maneuvers. So around the door frame, the sort of like the door swing. One thing that's happening on the side there, you start to see it in terms of what's happening on the left. It's actually moving around a tree that's just outside. And you can see in terms of just the peaks that are happening within the house, and then the trail of lines that actually goes back to where the original window is. And I was pretty careful that the amount of tubes, basically the kind of cross-section of the tube was the same as if you were to take the surface area of the original window. Now it's scattered throughout the space, so the light quality is very, very different. And of course, now these are extruded and extended. So there's kind of a very different sort of occupant to the space and volume to considering what instead used to be simply a window or an aperture that's not meant to be seen, but meant to be seen through. And I was interested in trying to understand, this is, of course, if I go back here, this is an image, you can see the sun coming in through the door. This is by day. I was interested in trying to understand maybe how the effect could also be considered during nighttime. So flipping it instead when the darkness is actually on the exterior. So I installed little solar panels on the roof, and those were capturing energy by day and then actually illuminating lights that were within the wall. So I had embedded them into the wall so that you would get the light leaking out at night as well. And these had, again, sort of just paying careful attention to what some of the details were doing. These were just simple tubes that were flared and bent, twisted and turned in different directions, because I was also interested in just the perchance grabbing what might be some of the weather conditions or a different variation of the wind and how that might sound in the tube. But one thing that I think emerged out of that unexpectedly, but continues to be something that comes in my mind when I think about details, is actually the shadows that occurred along the elevation, to the point where with certain angles of the light, the glass actually falls away and all you see is the shadow. So this drawing is shifting across the face. In terms of the exterior, while on the interior you can imagine that the light's shifting based on where the sun's actually located. So here's a couple more details, a little bit with what's happening there. The piece is very much so coordinated to the angle of the siding, so that it came with a particular ease in terms of where the hole, obviously adding holes to the wall in this case, is working with the ability to match the siding and work cleanly, as we were actually drilling from the interior to the exterior to pull this off. And then this sort of gives the kind of final image, obviously a nighttime image with the lights illuminated on both sides, so with the light in the middle of the wall section. At night, you get the lights. They're also matching. We get these kind of amazing sunsets in Detroit sometimes that are very golden. So this was a key shot for me in the sort of record of the project, especially with the work being now intentionally off the grid as well, with the electrical lines there in the background too. The next project I want to share is called Overnight. This one's actually, for me, of great interest, and maybe kind of pairing it now, thinking through this sort of kind of tracing or ghosting with the space. Overnight is both an exhibition as well as an installation, so I'm going to talk back and forth between the two a little bit. The work in the installation, I'll mention, is in itself trying to archive a moment in the city of Detroit that actually no longer exists. And right before being asked to do this exhibition, it was a show at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. I was working on a lot of photography of capturing things at night. And that work actually took a great interest in thinking about what we were, and these are coming off maybe a little lighter than how they are, so just imagine these maybe a half step darker. The city of Detroit at that time was replacing all of the street lights, which used to be sodium vapor and wired with copper lines, and at that point were definitely not all of them working. They were being exchanged out for very bright LED street lights, which maybe you can hear by my voice I'm not a huge fan of. That were going to be electrified with aluminum wires that were going to run above ground, where the coppers used to run below ground. So there was just kind of all these changes that were happening. The one thing I was interested in with some of the nighttime photography that I had been developing was basically running ahead of our public lighting authority and capturing photographs of the spaces that were happening at nighttime that were going to vanish. And meaning that in the sense that I actually think that there's some really sort of wonderful things that happen when spaces fall into darkness, where we start to see things like color saturation changes, volumes recede. It's questionable what's in the foreground or the background. Literally parts of buildings erase. So things that I think begin to match along with our architectural imagination and maybe the belief of what's there and not there at night versus day. And something that I found that with the sort of super bright LED streetlights was going to be erased. So all the photographs in these series, these were taken in 2015, 2016, can no longer be taken anymore. This light quality is entirely gone. So I was making an archive of these streetscapes, a little bit in the sort of mourning and loss of that, some of these beautiful nighttime effects that we were getting. And at the same time, the installation work was working with the materials that were at hand in this process, thinking through the aluminum and the copper. Aluminum, of course, is not as conductive as copper, but often is not as easily or at that time was not as precious as a metal as copper, so less expensive and also less likely to be scrapped or taken in terms of scrapping. So I worked with the aluminum very carefully in a couple of ways. I'd mentioned already that a lot of times the work we're doing is literally trying to draw in space. So I was really interested in trying to make line work, or let's say lines that aggregating together would sum to a bigger mass. So I intentionally started to make lines out of basically trying to make the aluminum that much more inefficient, so winding it more and more and more to make it a longer and longer length. This comes, again, I guess I should mention as I see the next couple slides coming up, just the sort of drawing in space. Previous to that, just giving you hints of other things that Alibi Studio has done. We did a piece where the light was what was erasing the lines in space, so a piece where it was candles that burnt away the lines, talking about things like curfews. We did a work that was working with the copper line. So before this one, a kind of work that was amassing copper, which was literally being extracted from a building to then being remelted. So giving it this sort of interlude. And lines as well in terms of us letting them lead to different spaces. So this one, in terms of the aluminum, the intention was, of course, to make a comment in the sense of the material change that was happening. We also wanted to electrify them. So they had tiny little LEDs on the bottom of them, these super micro LEDs. So they're not electrified by much, but they were lines that were doing work of that. And then they started to be the palette from which we could begin to do some of the spaces that I was finding in the photographs. So these ghostly sort of figurations where a house is really, in essence, kind of vaporizing. Or something I like to work with is, in essence, how much, and I think this comes from the nighttime photography, how much of a space do you need to see for your brain or your interest or your spatial ideas to fill in the rest? So this was a moment where we used the material to make, in essence, two houses that are hung there together in the exhibition space. This came of particular, there's a couple of photographs that I think, in essence, sparked the interest of this project, this being one of them. Because of this photograph and the way the darkness and the trees are working, capturing what is left of that streetlight, you get the peak of the house, which is enough for us to understand that the rest of the house is there, or to question if it's actually gone at nighttime or not. Another key photograph was this one, where the tree has this ghostly atmosphere about it and this hovering presence that I think is, of course, just enough to understand the tree, but it held, for me, this photograph, this tree held this sort of beautiful atmosphere that kind of brought its attention and maybe gives it this atmosphere that it doesn't have by day, almost cloud-like in the sort of just partial shot of this tree. So I should also mention, you can start to see the little bit of LEDs. We held the aluminum up by tiny little threads of copper. So copper was supporting the aluminum, the above ground and the below ground at that time. And the copper was so fine, it's hard to even see. So at the top of these V shapes is the little bit of copper, and then it goes up, and it's actually ends up allowing us to have the sense that the sort of supports are not even there. And one thing that worked really well is it was supported, it was hung in a gallery space that had 4 walls, but 2 of them, which would be adjacent to each other, so a corner was full floor-to-ceiling windows. And so there's a lot of light when you immediately walk into the space, which is diagonal and opposite these windows. And so the installation is actually really hard to see when you enter the space. You're seeing these super delicate lines, the light coming in by day, which is when the gallery is actually open. The light coming in by day makes it hard to see the lines, so you actually have to maneuver around to get back. So you're facing the opposing walls, which were darkened out to host the photographs, to really start to see the sort of the brighter light that's occurring with the aluminum. And if the right sun is occurring as well, you end up getting the really sort of rich coppers hanging those pieces also. I think one thing that became really interesting then and important to us, of course, was how these looked at night, or how the whole exhibit, I should say, looked at night. With the photographs, they actually fall even more into darkness when they're not lit. So they're actually not lit at all. There's, it doesn't ever really come across well in terms of showing slides, but there's a way that we print them that they are very soft. And so when they're lit just by natural light and it falls into nighttime, they themselves darken even more. And so the gallery kind of falls into full darkness, and then we lit the installation, which is also called overnight, with bright LEDs from above. So the street lights, a call to kind of the street lights that were replacing the ones in Detroit at that time. So that these two houses, even with the gallery being closed at nighttime, were super bright. One success that I really love about this installation was that the museum's security team, who was there with me as I was installing and starting to install late in the night and was like fiddling with the lights, they understood the shift that they were seeing. They weren't by day able to see what was happening with the install, and at night how much it glowed. And the security team actually was the one who convinced the director of UMA that we should shut off all of the lights on the exterior of the museum for the duration of the show, because this was so bright. And it ended up being this sort of wonderful way to then continue to have the show be something that someone could really see from the exterior, because this is what was illuminating that whole area of the building at that time. And this, I would also say, it's kind of a key moment in some of our work. This goes back, for me, this goes back to the image I just showed about the tree, where in some angles, even if we're working with things that are implying particular architectural spaces, at different angles they fall away to be just atmosphere alone. And so there's an ability and kind of a real understanding about when you see something, or sort of the angle of approach, allowing you to either see that form or see that atmosphere. So one thing that then becomes really clear to us, and I wanted to show some of these projects as well, is we are very much interested in material-based research as well. And this comes from kind of the pursuit and interest of light, and in a way, I would say always trying to understand how we can best capture it or chase it. I think we're never fully getting it, but always kind of pursuing that goes with that. So I wanted to talk through a project, knowing that I'm also in a school of many makers, that's called Long Range, which is developed out of several projects. And Long Range, if we give it sort of summation, surprisingly, when you look at it, it's actually about acoustics. This work is working to actually coordinate together formation in glass, both optically and sonically, that I think is giving us wonderful light effects, but at the same time is also giving us these different geometric forms which pair along the acoustic spectrum to either work as we move across, and I'll explain how this happens, reflectively, diffusively, absorbatively, and with transmission as well. So I made this with several collaborators, and I'll mention it through as a way of also just showing how this sort of built up over time. For a long time, I've been doing work with one of my good friends and colleagues, Wes McGee, in terms of figuring out how to add more complex geometries to glass, out of a high interest in terms of how to allow that. Well, as we're pairing a lot of digital fabrication and several materials are able to get more complex in their form, glass is often falling behind as a harder material to work with, at least in the settings that several of us have access to. So we were working to try to figure out how we could, and with many failed experiments, use some of the slumping or sagging processes out there to work with forming glass in a way that would give us another chance to, again, as I was doing even in weatherizing, reconfigure the window to give us things that maybe are working more performatively with optics or acoustics, or a change of geometry that's opening us up to something else. So we went through a ton of experiments where we were forming, eventually forming things in sort of a catenary style, holding very closely to points in space, knowing that we could then sum them together. Some of our early work was just trying to see what kind of forms we could get by holding these pieces in space, flipping them upside down, and then if we're able to coordinate where we've had the precision of those points in space, then we're able to actually get the larger forms out of those. One thing that became interesting is we did different versions of these. Of course, there's a lot going on in terms of thinking just about how it's working optically. So you see the line work here is simply working with fluorescent tubes above, linear tubes above the piece, and it's the curvature that's in the glass that's actually giving us this beautiful line work. And a little bit of detailing in terms of just, how we hold it in place, but also just these kind of lines in space that take it up. This shows you actually the just sort of like simple parts of that. And we were also working with it, we had the chance to work with it in a couple of different spaces where we were able to see the kind of multiple reflections of it, getting more spaces. But I have to note that it was in this let's say, installation or variation of the form we were able to get, that we started to recognize that it was also working very strangely acoustically. So it being a hard surface, one that could have curvature and make shape, we were hearing things, of course, in terms of reflection. We were also starting to hear things when the sound, surprisingly, would be dampened in its form. So we had a couple more locations where we were able to hang it and basically kind of change a little bit of the volume of where it was, see it differently for its kind of optical setup and what was happening there. These are just a couple more formations where we did it to the point where we were able to get it down. In this case, we were actually trying to get it really close to the ground, both in terms of just the interest of seeing if we could get, in essence, we're always drawing in light, right? You start to see the light almost more than the glass. But we were also starting to recognize maybe some of the things that were happening with the sound work as well. And so in this case, we hung it really close to the floor so we could get under it and just do some, informal tests about how sound was reacting in there. And that's actually what shifted us to look at where the project I want to talk more about, long range, went. In its sort of details. This is an image, it's showing a lot what's happening optically, but you start to also see where the light isn't, are these small holes. And the small holes are something that allows us to pair with what's called Helmholtz resonation, or Helmholtz resonance, which is basically when, let's say there's a small hole in something with a volume behind it, you can absorb sound by the hole being something that sound waves can get in, but as they move around and bounce, they can't get back out. So we could be in this auditorium space, and there are architectural designs where there's even like gaps in between the walls, and if sound is able to go in there, it actually works quite absorbatively. Instead of being something, oftentimes things like felt or acoustic panels work well absorbatively, but geometry can do it as well. And so long range, basically moving from left to right, we started to work with curating the way we were slumping the glass to either be very flat, which is happening more on the left, to very slumped. And in that, also transforming through the way it would have slits and open up. And the slits and the opening up would give it access to the space beyond. So if we hung them together in bubbles, we were able to create spaces that things could work more carefully with sound. The nice thing is, and of course this is maybe a lot of my addition to some of the collaboration stuff, is a lot of the things that are also happening optically begin to be a way to read it as a part of a space, but to also read a little bit about how sound might work with it. So there's some strangeness that occurs when you see the sort of shift in the geometries, how much it's sort of opening or closed. If perforations on one side or the other are aligned or not aligned, this starts to talk through in terms of sound being able to go through, sound capturing on the inside. A lot of relationships, especially when you think of the qualities of light that are more wave-like, dealing with issues of qualities of sound that are also behaving in the wave-like. So if we have the bubbling on both sides, so this is how it ends up actually being able to work, is that by having two panes, which we're very familiar with in terms of windows themselves, that's where we're able to work with different things along the acoustic spectrum, either by the relationship to the surface that it's exposed to, or the cavities that some of the sound will also be exposed to. And then some of the other optical conditions that happen that we're still also working with in other ways is there are convex and concave maneuvers, and also this strangeness that occurs where something flat is now amongst other things that are curving, and a little bit of the optical quality that allows that to change. I think one thing that we find very interesting about this sort of way of forming these panes is that every piece in the system actually itself goes through all the transformation in its effort to get to its sort of location on, let's say, the way it's performing acoustically. So they all start flat. They all start with, if they're going to be open, they start with slits that are cut auxetically, which means if the piece slumps, auxetics allow a surface to unwind. So that's how our holes actually get bigger. We're not actually cutting holes into the panes of glass. We're just water jetting slits into the glass, and based on the slumping, that's how the slits become holes. And so each piece, it's a coordination of, in essence, when we just stop the sag from happening. And so they're all carrying through from what used to be flat to then opening up to be more available to either the space in the middle or the variations in curvature on the exterior. So we've tested these. We've taken them to acoustic lab to make sure that what I'm telling you is not just like full of you having to believe me that the sound is actually being captured. And so each of these are, in fact, absorbing sound. It's certainly not something that's going to replace our general typical acoustic panels, but I think for us sort of works towards this relationship where we can push more onto the performance of some of our spaces in materials that aren't generally thought of acoustically. And with glass, of course, we get the optics with that as well. So this work, this shows you a little bit, zoom in on this is the area that's most absorbative because one side has the perforations and the other side is solid. So this is a portion of that wall, if we think about that wall as a full spectrum, where the sort of light and sound goes in, gets locked in, and then as you move further this way, you start to get into, this is just before the other side gets perforated as well, which actually works more transmissively in terms of coming through. And then all sides, all locations actually diffuse as well. So the diffusion is coming from the curvature on the front, scattering out the sound. And then I think we're getting a lot from just the sort of optical conditions that happen by using, we specifically chose to use a darkened glass. This is actually just a glass that is meant for tinted windows. We have cutoffs given to us by one of our industry partners, or let's say extras, for glass that's meant to be privacy screens. And that's the darkened is what gives us the optical qualities. So I'm going to jump back in time now again, jumping through a couple of things here in terms of thinking about another way that we have investigated materials, but wanting this one now to slant a little bit more back to bigger maneuvers we've done on existing spaces. Salvage Landscape is a project we've done quite some time ago, but I'm sharing it today as a warm-up to the last project that I'll show. Salvage Landscape, in its simplest description, is the curation of the demolition of a building that was hit by arson. And became, I think, a really sort of foundational to our, the ways that Alibi Studio really works through process. And I think you're seeing process in many ways from our material experiments, our installations, and how we're actually working with larger buildings. But Salvage Landscape, this was a house that's across from our train station, which is under massive renovation right now. And the house itself, I was originally brought into the project to help with figuring out how to turn the site into an outdoor gallery space once the building was demolished. So I was asked to sort of understand and look at the gallery, primarily with the foundation and the yard of the space, and in doing so, be the first exhibition within this space. And I realized as we started to work through that maybe the opportunity for that sort of shift into the space was literally in the physical transformation of the house itself. That itself was, I think, a kind of key relationship to tending to the space and reworking the architecture. So the efforts actually literally started with tending to and taking care and carefully working through how does one take down a house. And with that, of course, I'd say, and honing in very carefully on material opportunities. The house was not fully, the fire was put out, so the house did not fully burn down, and what was left there then is the remnants of the original house with very bulbous material texture, bulbous and very shiny. A material kind of quality to the wood that is, of course, only there once there has been a fire. And so my initial work was actually tending to the site and slowly sort of curating it. For a long time, this is in essence our sort of our space, and slowly, carefully, safely working with the space to kind of remove this and move this along. And so there are several key moments in terms of just thinking about transformation of space and the space that's there. This is a moment where you could see part of the second floor. From below, it actually became, I'm not going to talk about the project Second Story tonight, but it became the reason that I then did a project called Second Story. And really just kind of these key moments that allowed us, I think, to pause, to think about spaces as they were, but what they could be at this moment when they're no longer asked to be what they once were. So I started to really kind of curate and archive the wooden members that were coming out of the house. There were several sortings happening. Bricks were being saved, tiles were being saved. I was the one on the kind of demolition team saving the wood. It's actually at this moment where there is, in a way, one way to look at it, the sort of perfect section cut of the house, that the project Salvage Landscape really sort of took form. And so you can start to see it in the section of the house there. I began to use the house as the palette and the formwork to reinsert the wood back into the space and make a very dense portion of the house that would not be possible, of course, without the house having gone through this fire. And so this maybe gives you a little bit more of a detail. You can start to see with the wood not being burnt all the way through, the slice of that wood opened up to some fresh, more uncharred wood. And so there was this simple cut, both the section cut of the house, but the section cut of that material, to give these long planks that were inserted then back into the house very carefully, with an interest to make a way to think about occupying that space in a new way. So this kind of jumps forward in the process, but shows that this is the opening, which is facing towards the back of the house, and using this as a way to move now into the house again. So I'm going to now just walk you into that space. So deeper into the opening, you see a little bit more of the slants. There's a crack here, which I'll mention again, which is important to one of the light effects. This is looking back around to the other side, back to the backyard. Now walking back around again through that, out to the side, there's another doorway. This is in the old living room of the house. And then bringing you around the side to the front. And this actually was a pretty impactful moment in the installation because the wood had been burned, at least in part. It's very light. And so we were able to do these very long cantilevers that were moving back into the space. This is actually the space of where the original fire was. And able to suspend in a long manner because they're so light. And for us, it was a way also to darken the space, add a sort of dark and a little bit of a morning back into that space. And so we also were working on a site of this house no longer had electricity. So this would set our pace for the day. We had darkened so much that space by adding chars back inside. We had to end each day at sunset. Which actually affected the project and its form greatly. I mentioned that slit earlier, which you can see a little bit now in the passageway as well. So the house, this is an image in October. The house aligns, the front face is aligning with sunset. You can see the golden sunset coming through, we recognized that on the charred members, it was making this beautiful golden quality as well. So it came later in the installation. We actually opened that slice back up. So at sunset, we were getting this short momentary grays of a kind of golden light before it all became very, very dark. And this is a key moment where all of that was stabilized, the kind of section cut is stabilized, and it kind of shows the next step, which is, of course, to take down the rest of the house, given its condition. And the next step is to remove the 3 rooms that are the formwork for salvage landscape. And so that unearthed this deep mass. This is, in essence, half the wood of the house, now condensed down into a larger core. Some key details, we, of course, could not see what it would look like as we were sliding it in, but we particularly had saved these pieces for the exterior. They're all from the roof line and the joist because it wasn't burnt all the way through. You get those stripes. So we were very careful to slide those in, anxiously awaiting what it would look like when it got to this moment. And then that sort of kind of deep core seen from another angle that gets you that passageway that we walked through earlier. And this project laid in my brain for a very long time as I came upon or started to work with the big project I want to show you and end with called Secret Sky. In 2017 now, I think it was, I was asked to become the next designer in an initiative that's happening in Port Austin, Michigan, where a group of curators is working with designers and artists to save or reimagine the barns that are up in Port Austin that are no longer being used. There's a lot of very iconic wooden barns. Much of them are not being used because now there's these giant aluminum barns. Machines have gotten bigger. Livestock is treated in a different way up there, and the grounds are kept in a way. So these barns are sitting there often ailing kind of in their care because they aren't even needed for equipment or livestock anymore, but they're left, of course, as spaces that I think also, are iconic to many, many locations, but definitely here as well. So we were asked to think through, and this is actually an important moment that we'll return to as you see the little bit of sky coming through this barn. But in our sort of process, hopefully it's, one thing that's clear in our work is that there is a kind of relationship to tending to spaces. If we're working in spaces that exist, a lot of the work which goes unseen and maybe uncelebrated is literally caring for that space and working carefully with it. So for us, we had to first deal with some foundation problems that were occurring and some columns, and really also just kind of work through what material was there, what material could be reused. All the while, extremely interested in the barn actually starting to feel like almost a small object in this very great sky and landscape. And it seemed as well that perhaps its primary occupant, and this is of course the lens I have been mentioning, but the primary occupant to now be the sky and its sort of relationship to the changing sky and what is a very elongated sunset, sunrise, and exposure to that. So I'll show you the end so it makes the rest of the process photos make sense. But we ended up creating a big slice in the barn space. We took that slice all the way through so that light would pass through, and you can, of course, see this relationship to what I just discussed in salvage landscape. But we also turned the siding inwards, so we were basically making a void in that space so that you could walk through the barn, but in essence, you can never get in it again. So it split it in 2 forms and really tried to carefully work with the details to integrate with what was there and to maybe imply that it has always been this way and that the sort of occupation now, of course, at a human scale, but the relationship to the sky being its kind of main, the thing that's always around for it now, let's say. Otherwise, it's actually a pretty vacant site outside of its visitors. So we worked with a barn that was set, north is up in this photograph, The short face is parallel to a road. You can also see that there's a line of trees before that. And then this moment that the road, which has quite a high speed limit, comes and has a kind of alignment with a driveway, which ends up being a sort of very key moment to, which I'll show you a few shots from, a key moment to seeing the barn and its relationship to the landscape beyond. We also had moments very early in the project, not dissimilar from some of the other work I've shown, where some of the light effects really affected later decisions. This is on the interior, and as a lot of you know, the spacing of the siding for airflow really brings in these beautiful light effects that make these line works in anything that they're falling on. And it's something that's key to one of our later decisions. So the work into this actually, this was done, Alibi Studio was the designer, and with help of Etc. Construction Services, we were the builder as well. So this was done very, very slowly, along with Shepherd Engineering as the structural engineers, to restructure the barn to be able to take this slice, because the work of making this, this slice all the way through meant that we were cutting through a major beam and just grazing past one of the columns. So we had to restructure the barn, new foundation walls for the slice, but also some new structure to make this possible. And then also, I think something that's key to understanding is that the slice is going through the front facade, which is on the right here. We're inside the slice looking up, of course, and also through the roof. That's what makes this kind of, it's a triangle that's extruded all the way through. So if you can imagine that cut happening, it's taking the facade, the interior, and a portion of the roof. The interior, so in doing so and turning these walls inward, we're adding a lot of surface area to that. So we saved as much of the barn wood that we could. We actually remade some of the structure with parts of a hayloft that was in the space and that we were also cutting through. We needed more siding though, and the siding actually came from what was supposed to be the next barn for the next designer. When we were working in this, the neighboring, a barn about a mile away blew down in a windstorm. So the owner switched gears and donated us the rest of that siding so that the siding from his barn can now be the inside of Secret Sky, a way for us to sort of save two of the barns. So seen from the back, this is, I think, a helpful way to understand the geometry as well. The slanted wall here and the one that makes this very thin sliver building, the inside of that is sided with the wood from the neighboring barn. And we worked really carefully to create details that would work. We've now, and I'll show you in a second, added a new roof so we could get things like the gutter and the soffit and everything to take the slice, but also take the elements as needed. And again, as I was mentioning, really trying to working with the patterns to allow the detailing to fit very closely in and give that. So strange soft details that end up coming to a crazy point to make that sharp edge happen. And then looking back up into the slice, there's just some really interesting moments in terms of cropping and seeing the sky and just these kind of elongated spaces when you're inside. The width of the slice is only 4 feet, so it has this very strong way of feeling the kind of presence of its height. And of course works really carefully with shade and shadow and how the light's coming through. This gives you a little sense just to show a little bit with the volume and the geometry of how that slice goes through the front and the back, giving this small little building on the outside. And then the key shot, which comes from being straight on, and what you see in the driveway is really this kind of moment where the landscape beyond is what's coming through. And so constantly, Secret Sky is helping to sort of curate and amplify the sky that's coming from beyond, what that lighting quality is like. This gives you the solid sort of sunset as entering on the driveway, and just what sort of, as it falls into the kind of silhouetting. We were interested in this project as well, and this will now tie back to some of the earlier work with weatherizing. Interested in thinking about what its nighttime qualities are. We definitely have the sort of daytime and sunset, and then I really like to have the barn fall totally into darkness, where that sort of silhouette's gone and the sky is gone. So we also, though, to do the night effect, in this case now much bigger ones, we have some solar panels that were added to the outside of Secret Sky so we could get that quality that I mentioned on the interior before on the exterior at night. And this was something we noticed when we were doing late night installation. We had our large construction lights turned on, right? And the lights that you saw before that were coming inside the barn, we could get them now as drawings onto the landscape. So each night, I set up a sensor. The sensor waits for twilight. Well, it waits for sunset, and then it waits into twilight, so it counts for about 45 minutes. And then these lights turn on, which means it's gone into darkness. The lights turn on for 2 hours and then turn back off. And really give these nice sort of lines on the landscape. I actually love it in the other direction because it goes up those trees I was mentioning before and really sort of draws back onto the landscape. So again, it's sort of trying to consider the primary occupant to be the sky, the landscape, and the surroundings of the barn. We did recently get the chance, we raised some money to replace, there was asphalt shingles on top of the old cedar shingles, and those were just going through wear and tear. So we raised some money from the Michigan Economic Cultural Council, gave us money that we matched to give an aluminum roof to the barn. And so we also had this really beautiful moment that we have been photographed, but only 4 of us were able to see, which is the moment when we took the roof off, and now these lines are going not just all over the landscape, but we're going up as well. This was kind of an incredible moment for us, as we really love to study our projects as they change as well. And so that gave us 2. Thankfully, we had a drone doing all of this. The drawings of our work while we were changing. This happened. Never have I wanted snow during a construction setup on any of the projects, but it worked really sort of a lovely way for us to document the work of re-roofing Secret Sky so it could stay for many, many more decades. And of course, the kind of line work of how we worked to do that, I think, is a beautiful sort of moment. And then this gives the, this is actually not the sun, but the moon. Which is just kind of by chance to have been there one night where the moon aligned with the slice as well. People often ask me if I did anything celestial on purpose, and instead I think it's more of the kind of being there, and with all of our projects, kind of being there at that particular time, telling that particular story, tending to that space, and sort of appreciating as you're occupying that space, which sort of light or darkness is there with you. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much. These are our sort of long stories of our projects that are carrying on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Catie, thank you for that fantastic work. Would anybody, we can open the floor for questions, if anybody has questions. Maybe I'll get the ball rolling.
Okay. Second floor questions.
You considered photography at night is really great. I tried doing photography at night before, and it's not worked out good. So what would you say is the prime time at night to do photography, or is it really just a matter of the camera that you have and the specific lensing and the making? I don't know if you use Photoshop and can help get a certain effect afterwards, but what would you say is the best combination in order to get a night lighting effect?
Yeah, thanks for the question, because photography is super important to our work and becomes our kind of sketchbook, I would say, of figuring things out. For me, it's been a lot of trial and error throughout the years, and it depends on 2 things. I'd say my major, if you're getting a particular shot, of course, a kind of tripod set up and a lot of patience bracketing what you are doing. If it's a shot that comes with great cadence, meaning that you might be holding it or you need to get it very quickly, I actually have a very sensitive ISO set, and that gives me both a little bit warmer colors, and it also gives me the swiftness to take that shot. It might mean that my photographs can't be blown up to, say, a billboard without recognizing that the ISO is so sensitive, but it does allow me to get a lot of what I'm doing. And then I'm also very particular about, you have to be very careful about like what lights are coming towards the lens versus what might be behind you instead. It's a lot easier if things are behind you instead of the things coming towards the lens because of the ability for the same thing that happens by day, the flares. So I just recommend a ton of bracketing if you have the patience, and being really careful, the aperture that you want and then the shutter that allows you to get the light qualities. It might be really long. Hopefully that helps.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I definitely have a bunch. But I won't bore you. Hi, Katie. Thank you so much for coming, first of all. I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about, you mentioned process early on.
Yep.
And I'm really interested, because I also dabbled in glass a little bit. Well, I'm an architectural grad student, but I did, like all last year, I took glass classes every chance I got.
So you're sitting next to the right person, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so I wanted to also kind of tie into that process question about how you might reflect on your working with glass and how that's impacted your architectural process.
Yeah, definitely. Architectural process for me, I guess maybe because I really like making with spaces that are existing and really put material and effects first. It's not a lot of drawing for me. It's a lot of literally being, and I do say things like I'm drawing on site in terms of making things out of like long line work or something like that. But I actually, second stories, I certainly have a whole architectural set for that to working with a structural engineer, but the rest of the projects I don't have that. And I think what that does for me as well is that I'm open to changing something as I go, because it's really if I can keep the kind of material and effects forward as being like, oh, this is a great, I didn't expect this to happen, or this is better than I thought it could possibly be. Those actually end up being the parts of the project that I think really bring it to another level, if I allow it to not be what I thought I was going to do in the first place. So with glass that happens, and Anna and I have been working, I'm collaborating with Anna Grabowski this week on an installation, same sort of thing. So when it comes to glass, glass, and I've been explaining this, in terms of being asked to be the glass visiting artist right now. Glass for me, because I like light so much, is basically my material crush. But I don't have as much expertise. I collaborate with those who work with it in such technical and beautiful ways. And so through the process of being like, let's try this, oh, this makes more sense, oh, glass doesn't want to do that, I just am constantly learning more. And then also the things that are like, oh, I didn't know it could do that, become the root of the project in the first place. So I think all of that architecturally and glass material research-wise is really just the chase, just starting to do something and then letting the project evolve. I don't actually, I just think our projects are stronger, meaning Alibi Studio, when we aren't starting, what should I say? We don't do a lot of work that is completely from scratch. It's just sort of like, we want to make this thing. Instead, we start working with something and then it evolves into what we don't expect, but we feel like we're just hanging out with our projects, really. Yeah.
So you mentioned why use existing structures, but why abandon ones, especially the ones that it seemed you were drawn more to the decrepit ones? Is there a reason for that?
I think it's a little bit about just I think a lot of times I respond to exactly where I am. So living in Detroit, there's a lot of, starting those works also at a moment when, in like 2009, when the economy crashed, and as a young architect, I had no money, no jobs, no clients. What was around me is what I started to work with. So I think that some of it ends up just being a kind of regional opportunity. Projects which I didn't show tonight are also things in terms of somebody asking me to do something in like an old castle, and somebody asking me, you know, to do something in like a old pharmacy and an old museum. So like those things have come up as well. Maybe also to your answer though, is a lot of times when spaces are, let's say, given up on, they fall away like that because no one is tending to them. And I think a lot of our practice is coming in and sort of tending to a space. And so maybe there's kind of a draw there of like learning and being able to care for it in a way that I think marks, they have the biggest opportunity to be transformed in an unexpected way, is what I would also say. So it's different, it feels different for us than somebody also saying, and Alibi Studio, you know, works on renovations too. We're currently renovating a motorcycle club to an artist studio. And it feels different if it feels more like renovating someone's space to have a different program, as opposed to renovating a space that has lost its program and now it gets to be a program that nobody would ever ask for. So I think that's maybe why we're drawn to those spaces. We get to do the things that, you know, Secret Sky, we gave it to the light, right? And there isn't, nobody asked me to be able, you know, like the light didn't come to me as much as I wish it did. So I think maybe your question, just thinking out loud, makes me realize that that's when we can do the work that's perhaps like, okay, we're just going to give this space over to something else that's maybe not human.
Time for a couple more.
And at the beginning of the presentation, you talked about some of the observations you made in the neighborhoods in Detroit. I was wondering I'm just curious what your opinion is about how we like cities. And Detroit is kind of a leftover or a area where there's, you know, where you see transitions going on. And we're all transitioning into different kind of lighting types, and you know, the discussion is about light pollution, that sort of thing. But I don't need you to kind of comment it as as something environmental, but more in the case of like, what do you think about when you talk, since you kind of work with darkness, like how do you see cities being lighted? Yeah. Especially since you made an observation.
Yeah, that's a great question.
And let me just further say, like, people critique light fixtures all the time.
Oh, totally.
In cities. So, like, where do we go from here?
You know, one thing, I feel like there's there's a couple of different veins to work, and I'm doing some research on, you know, some new glass work that has to do with us being more tied into our circadian rhythms, and there's the arguments with light pollution and things like that. I think one thing that I've recognized in doing all this that I feel like my work is also, I don't know, sort of defending, is that we don't let a lot of darkness or night into our lives, and I think we're actually missing something because of that. It can be really calm, it can be super beautiful. It can also be something that, like, if we don't get the darkness, our brains are getting totally fried. And so there's a little bit, I feel like all of these answers come out of me having to defend the work for so many years too. Like, why let something fall into darkness, or what are we getting it from the night? But there's another umbrella that goes with that I just think it's absolutely sort of magical how it changes space. And it's kind of a sort of like neglected effect that is also sometimes compared to light, but it's actually like as in being the opposite of light, but it's totally its own thing. And we don't work with it. We're not necessarily, because of that, I think a lot of people aren't comfortable sitting in the darkness. I think that not everyone's getting a sort of like reset, especially now in the age of like screens and super bright lights. I don't know, I think it affects us in a way that we don't understand. And so I try to have the kind of like calming of it and the beauty of it be something that maybe as we're celebrating I don't know how many people in here have been to Sedona before, where they have you have to turn off as much as possible artificial light by 10 p.m. every night. I love that there. And so even if there is an outdoor light, it's like this tiny little light on the ground that would get somebody to your doorstep or something like that. And there's just this like super calm that comes with that, I think, that we're missing in a lot of places that we don't give ourselves. Lots of answers to answer that, but I just think that we have like light just wipes it away, and there's a loss there. And the celestial sky, I actually, sometimes too, the celestial sky is so bright that we don't get darkness either. So it just gets wiped away.
Thank you very much, guys. Let's give a round of applause.